Good morning. My name is Cameron McElhenney, and I am the Director of Training and Education for the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I would like to welcome you to NACOLE's 2019 webinar series. Today, we'll be discussing false confessions, interrogations, and investigative interviewing techniques. The purpose of today's webinar is to bring attention to both good and bad interviewing techniques and give you a base of information on which you can build. Before I turn things over to our presenter, I would like to go over a few things regarding the format of today's program. During the webinar, all attendees will be muted. You may send any questions you have during the presentation for Dr. Russano by typing a question using the GoToWebinar control panel that popped on your screen when you signed in. She will then try to address them as she goes along through her presentation. At the conclusion of the webinar, each of you will be given the opportunity to complete a brief survey on today's event. Please take a few moments to complete the survey to help us as we plan for future events in our webinar series. I would like to now introduce you to today's presenter. Melissa Russano is a professor of criminal justice in the School of Justice Studies at Roger Williams University. Her research addresses various psychological and criminological aspects of investigative interviewing, including the process of interrogation and confession. Since 2007, Dr. Russano has received more than $1.9 million from the U.S. Department of Defense and Justice for her investigative interviewing and interrogation-related research. She has published numerous peer-reviewed publications in scholarly outlets relevant to investigative interviewing, including the publication of an influential, widely utilized paradigm for studying interrogations in the laboratory. In addition, she regularly presents to academic and practitioner audiences such as this on the topics of investigative interviewing, interrogation, and confession. Dr. Russano.
Yes, hi everybody. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and for inviting me to do this. And I'm hopeful now that my screen is able to be viewed. And I'm assuming if I don't hear from, okay, all right, so we're all set. So again, thank you. And I do welcome questions as I go along. I prefer for it to be interactive, so please do type in those questions. And if I don't get to anyone during the presentation, I will come back to them towards the end and hopefully have enough time for everybody's questions. So what I'm going to do for the presentation is I'm going to give you an overview of the issue of false confessions, the phenomenon of false confessions, and talk about the risk factors that lead to false confessions. And then I'm going to be talking to you about where the field is moving in terms of the science of good interviewing and science-based interviewing and interrogation. So I want to start by just setting the stage with a real life case of a false confession. So the pictures you see on the screen are related to a case of a man by the name of Carl Chapman. And back in 2002, a woman was raped, or she alleged that she was raped in Chicago at her workplace early one morning. Carl Chapman was a schizophrenic, homeless veteran with an IQ of about 68. And he was brought in for questioning and ultimately confessed after being held for nearly 26 hours and of on and off interrogation. His statement wasn't, he had started to admit to the crime around 12 to 14 hours after he was first taken in and questioned, but it wasn't until almost 26 hours later that they took a written statement from him. He served so he was convicted in 2004. He served until 2013 when the Conviction Integrity Unit in Cook County actually took another look at the case and concluded that not only was Carl innocent, but they didn't believe that the rape had ever occurred. They believed it was a false allegation, and it led to his actual exoneration. He has a certificate of innocence, and recently a civil trial was settled, a civil case was settled, and I was involved in that civil litigation. So Carl is just one of many, many people in this situation. Many of you may be familiar with the Innocence Project, which is an organization that is dedicated to exonerating the actual innocent through the use of post-conviction DNA testing. And to date, there have been 367 exonerees. The pictures you see on the screen is the most recent exoneree as of, I believe, a week and a half ago. And this gentleman was also a false confessor, so he falsely confessed The picture on the upper side of the screen is him with his mother while he was incarcerated, and the picture on the lower part of the screen is actually the mother of the victim who helped exonerate him and fight for his exoneration. And his name is, I believe his first name is Christopher and last name is Tapp. So I want to just give you a little sense of who these people are that are part of the DNA exoneration cases, and also how it is that these wrongful convictions occur. And one of the important things about DNA, the advent of DNA, is that it allows us to go back and, first of all, identify those who've been wrongfully convicted, but also to look at what factors led to those wrongful convictions. And so this chart here is showing you the leading causes of wrongful convictions. So as you can see, for example, the large majority of cases have a mistaken eyewitness identification involved in that case. Sometimes multiple identifications. Junk forensic science comes in number 2, and you'll see that false confessions are playing a role in about 28% of these wrongful DNA exoneration cases. When you look at specifically the most serious of cases, that percentage goes up. We see high percentage of false confessions, for example, in homicide cases. And I'll come back to that statistic in a minute. A surprising number of these DNA exonerees were excluded by DNA prior to trial and plea. And I bring this up because this usually surprises most people. Most people assume that if there was DNA that excluded the person prior to a trial or prior to a plea or a guilty plea, that it would never have led to a wrongful conviction. But there is a number there. It is not uncommon for exculpatory DNA to be present and known to the prosecution and defense, and for a person still to be convicted or take a guilty plea. And that speaks to the power of other evidence that can overshadow DNA evidence, in particular confession evidence. So of the 35 exonerees who were excluded by DNA prior to trial and plea, 2/3 of them had falsely confessed. And that speaks to the power of a confession. It is very hard for anyone to understand why somebody would confess to a crime they didn't commit, absent torture or extreme circumstances where maybe they were covering for a loved one. So when you have a case where someone confesses and there's exculpatory DNA, oftentimes what happens is that they explain away the DNA. So for example, if you're familiar with the Central Park jogger case, the boys in the 5 boys who were convicted in that case, there was semen that was found on the jogger at the time of the crime. And by the time of trial, they knew that that semen didn't match any of the boys. But the prosecution was able to explain it away by saying that there must have been a 6th perpetrator who was unidentified who left the semen behind. So sometimes confessions trump DNA evidence. In terms of the demographics of false confessors themselves, so just looking at the population of false confessors, we tend to see an overrepresentation of younger people. So about 50%, a little 49% are 21 years or younger. And if you isolate that to 18 years or younger, you're looking at about 33%. So a large or an overrepresentation of youth. You also see a relatively high percentage of mental illness or cognitive deficits relative to the general population. So about 10% of false confessors fall into that category in this DNA exoneration population. And remember that I mentioned that if you look specifically at the most serious of cases, so homicide, for example, the percentage of false confessors is really high. So of those people who were convicted of homicide, 62% had falsely confessed, which is also really counterintuitive, because perhaps you can imagine falsely confessing to a minor crime where the penalty wouldn't be so severe. But most people would think when the stakes are the highest, when your life is at stake, essentially, that you'd be least likely to falsely confess. But in fact, what we find is that the percentage of false confessions go up in those cases, most likely because that's when the pressure is the highest for the police to get a confession. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about 3 different types of false confessions. These are categories that researchers find helpful in distinguishing between different types of false confessions, and they are voluntary, coerced compliant, and coerced internalized. I'm going to come back to each of those, but before I do, I want to touch upon Miranda. So I won't belabor this point because I know this isn't a law enforcement audience. However, when Miranda was put into place, the idea was that this would protect suspects, and that it would be a safeguard in the interrogation room against not only coercion, but would also protect innocent suspects. The reality of Miranda is that most people waive their Miranda rights. So it's estimated between 75 and 80% of suspects will waive their Miranda rights. That's for a variety of reasons. The first of which is a lot of people don't really understand their Miranda rights, but also because most people assume that if they invoke Miranda, it'll make them look guilty. A guilty suspect doesn't want to look guilty, and an innocent suspect thinks they have nothing to hide. So innocent suspects are actually more likely than guilty suspects to waive, even though most guilty suspects waive as well. Okay, so in terms of different types of false confessions, a voluntary false confession is, as the name implies, one in which is given voluntarily, absent any pressure or coercion from the police. So this would be the situation where someone walks into the police station essentially and says, I want to confess to a crime, even though they didn't do it. Why would someone do this? Well, the number one reason that someone does this is to protect somebody else. So covering for a loved one, a family member, or a friend. But there are some other reasons as well. So sometimes mental illness plays a role here, where somebody has a desire to be famous, or they have some sort of need to be punished for some other reason, or they're actually confused about whether or not they committed the crime. But the key here is that it didn't come from an external source. The picture on the screen there, if you don't recognize those two individuals, the little girl is JonBenet Ramsey, whose name might be familiar to many of you, who was found murdered in her home. This was back probably in the early 90s. Case went unsolved. The parents came under suspicion. Years later, the man that you see on the screen, John Mark Carr, came forward and confessed to having killed JonBenet. He was very quickly dismissed as a suspect. It was not a credible confession, but it's an example of a voluntary false confession where he had some mental health issues and wanted to be famous and get the notoriety associated with confessing. The next type of false confession is coerced compliant false confession. This is when somebody who didn't commit the crime confesses to committing the crime, and they do so usually because of the interrogation process itself. So they know they're innocent, but because whatever is going on in the interrogation, they land up confessing for some benefit or instrumental gain. So that can be anything from they are exhausted, they just want to go home, they want to make this situation end, to they believe that if they confess, the ultimate punishment will be less. So they come to believe that even though they're innocent, they're gonna be convicted of this, and if they confess, the punishment will be far less worse than if they continue to deny. So there's some benefit, some reason that they come to believe that it's in their best interest to confess, even though they know at the time of confession they're innocent. The majority of false confession cases that beyond voluntary that we see would fall into this category. The Central Park jogger case would be an example of that, and those are the boys you see pictured at the bottom of the screen. All of those boys gave statements implicating themselves, but they really thought that they were mostly pointing the finger at each other. They all knew at the time that they were confessing that they were innocent, but they all came to believe in the course of that interrogation that it was in their best interest to confess. The third type is a coerced internalized false confession. And as the name might imply, it's a situation in where somebody internalizes their guilt. So in other words, they confess, even though they're innocent, because they come to question their own innocence. They come to believe that they actually committed the crime, even though they may not remember committing the crime. And in really extreme cases, you can have people develop false memories of that crime. These are certainly the most rare type of false confession. They are probably the most psychologically interesting false confession, if speaking from a psychologist's opinion. And there are two key factors that are almost always present in these cases. And those factors are memory vulnerability and false evidence. So if you are to be convinced that you committed a crime that you can't remember committing, the first thing that needs to happen is you have to have some reason for why you wouldn't remember having committed the crime, right? So the person who's trying to convince you did it is going to have to give you some plausible explanation for why you don't remember. That typically comes in the form of drugs or alcohol use, blacking out, repressing the memory, sleep deprivation, or that the crime happened a long time ago and you've essentially forgotten about it. That coupled with false evidence. So for some people, if you can get them to believe, give them some reason why they don't remember the time period in question, and then you present them with false evidence of their guilt. We found your DNA, we have your fingerprints, you failed a polygraph and the polygraph is infallible. And they believe that police can't lie to them. For some people, that opens up a door to coming to believe that they committed the crime, even though they didn't. And that picture below is a young man by the name of Michael Crow. He's pictured with his two sisters. The one with the brunette hair, it was murdered in his home. One morning, the family woke up, they found Stephanie Crow to be murdered. The police quickly focused in on Michael, who was 14 years old at the time. They believed he wasn't emotional enough given his sister's death. They landed up taking the kids, the two surviving children, separated them from the parents and interrogated Michael over the course of 2 days, unbeknownst to his parents, where he came to believe that he committed the crime of murdering his sister, although he had no memory of it, and gave a detailed confession of doing so. Luckily, on essentially the eve of trial, Michael was cleared because blood was found on a shirt of a drifter who had been picked up in the area on that same day, and it turned out to be Stephanie's blood. And that wasn't, though, until I think Michael was incarcerated for almost a year awaiting trial. Okay, so those are different types of false confessions, but why do false confessions occur? What's going on that leads us to these obvious tragedies? So I'm going to talk about three different groups of risk factors: individual risk factors, situational risk factors, and what I'm going to call investigator tunnel vision. So starting with individual risk factors, you heard me talk about earlier with the Innocence Project that we see an overrepresentation of certain groups of people, specifically younger people, those with lower cognitive abilities, and those with mental illness. And those are all risk factors for false confessions. And what I mean by that is people who are mentally ill, people who have lower cognitive abilities, younger people, particularly children and adolescents, are more likely to provide a false confession as compared to people who don't fit those categories. So they are at higher risk. They are more vulnerable in the interrogation room. But that is not to say that these are the only people who provide false confessions. It would be a mistake to think that this can only happen to people in these categories. But it is true that people in these categories are more likely to provide a false confession than others. Then there's the situational risk factors. So that's what's happening in the interrogation room itself. Now, American-style interrogation is what we refer to as an accusatorial confrontational process. It's designed to rampen up the anxiety of a suspect. And essentially, I like to think of it as a pressure cooker. Create a pressure cooker situation where the only way out is to confess. And the goal of an American-style interrogation is to get a confession. That is what police are trained to do once they've made the decision to initiate an interrogation as opposed to an interview. Their goal at that point is to take a confession from the person and to shut down any denials. So here's a pictorial of what the accusatorial approach typically looks like in North America, where we isolate a suspect away from any contact with social support. They are then taught to confront the suspect essentially with their accusation of guilt, that they know that the person did it, there's no point in denying it, to rampen up their anxiety about the situation, and then to come around and do what we call minimization, which is to downplay why the person may have committed the crime through usually face-saving excuses like blaming the victim or suggesting that what the person did wasn't so bad or could have been worse, in the hopes that that person will then take the out, so to speak, and confess to the crime. So I have a video that I'm just going to play a few minutes of it so you can see what an accusatorial interrogation sometimes looks like. So hopefully this works.
I'm going to tell you what happened, okay? We got a call from a neighbor about somebody discharging a firearm, okay?
Yeah.
From that point on, this nosy neighbor, or whatever we're going to call him, has monitored, and I'm not going to tell you how, okay? Just think about it. With today's technology, monitored what was going on in front of this residence that they were calling to complain about until police arrived. This witness, this complainant, the person that called police, is documenting what is going on. Okay? He's documenting. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you?
That they're pointing the finger at me?
No, forget that. They're documenting the fact of whatever's going on in front of the house. Just with a camera, with a cell phone, you can record shit nowadays. Again, after the person calls police, he begins to document, maybe film, what's going on in front of this house. So it's one of the easiest investigations I've had. It's fucking there. And you can't lie about that, bro. I'm giving you an opportunity.
I'm not lying.
Listen to me. I'm giving you an opportunity. Listen to me. Listen to me. But when you're telling me that you didn't have that firearm in your hand, we can prove otherwise. We can prove otherwise. I can prove it. I can go in front of the judge and say, hey, look, bro, you want us to play this video? You want us to show you the fingerprint results? You want us to show you the GRE test on this gentleman?
I did not have that firearm in my hand.
Huh?
Is there any reason why your fingerprints are going to be on there?
They're not going to be on there.
Any reason why we got an eyewitness to you shooting that gun? Can you explain to my partner and I why you were positively identified as the person who shot that gun?
It's a misconception. That's a lie. I did not shoot that gun. I did not have a firearm in my hand.
We can prove that. We're beyond that point, buddy. We're beyond that, man. And based on our investigation and the trajectory and stuff like that, we sort of believe that
I did not have that firearm in my hand at all.
It could have been a fucking accident. It could have been an accidental discharge. Okay, but when you're completely denying that, then I gotta think another way, bro. Because,
dude, it's the truth. I didn't have that firearm in my hand whatsoever.
Well, you're saying this person that complained and called initially, document was recording shit, dude. I'm trying to find out intent because a camera doesn't tell me what intention your brain
There's
has.
no intention.
Or
for
Richard,
Richard didn't want to kill the cop. He was shooting the ground. I'm not gonna have some son of a bitch across the road since they're telling you guys that I was the one pulling the trigger.
You're not the only. That's not the only person, unfortunately. Remember, you're the last one that we spoke to at this point. There's more people than just the nosy neighbor that called the police, bro. There's people you live with. There's people responding deputies. And you know, Woody, I've only been honest with you, bro. I've only been honest.
Yeah, I've been honest with you.
No.
Don't roll your eyes at me like you're a fucking 5-year-old. We have an eyewitness that shows you, okay, you come outside after the 3 shots are fired, watches you take a level platform, one hand, boom, and shoots across the top of those bushes. We're going to process that fucking gun, and you know what it's going to tell us? Your prints are on that gun. Now, when we present all this shit to the fucking judge, and your lawyer's going, yeah, dude, maybe you shouldn't have fucked with these detectives.
I'm not fucking with you. I didn't touch that gun whatsoever.
You
I
didn't.
know what I did.
Yeah.
I know what I did. I drank beer and watched freaking Woodson shoot the shit in the ground.
Right. Okay.
And
And
I
after
didn't know.
that happened, you went inside.
I
You were
went,
listening,
boom.
and you came outside and you shot another round.
I did not. I didn't do it.
Yes, you did.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
I did not.
This is like I'm dealing with a 5-year-old, Jimmy. That's what I can't understand.
There's people saying you did. Your buddies are saying you fucking did. We got independent witnesses.
I didn't do it.
You can't tell us that you didn't fucking fire that 4th shot anymore. You can't tell us. We can prove otherwise. And if you do, the fucking judge is gonna throw the fucking book at you. You fired that 4th shot, brother. We can prove it.
There was only 3 shots.
No, there's 4.
Okay. So, just wanted to give you a flavor of what this might look like. Let me get this screen back up. So, what we saw here was definitely an accusatorial interrogation. It is an example of, in my opinion, what not to do if you want to get cooperation from a suspect. But if you want to get resistance, that is certainly the way to go. What you saw in there, hopefully, was a lot of discussing of evidence, a lot of bluffing about evidence, about what they have, and probably some direct lying about evidence. And then what I tend to describe as techniques that imply leniency in exchange for confession. So you heard them say things like, when we have all this evidence and we present it to the judge, how's that going to look? Right? What they're clearly implying to him is, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. You're going to get much worse punishment once, if you don't confess than if you do confess. And we also see a lot of disclosing of evidence in a way that is probably leading to, if he was to ultimately provide a statement, to what we refer to as contamination, which I'll talk about later. There is a much better way to use evidence if you have true evidence in an interrogation room than what these detectives are doing, which is essentially to just throw out anything that they have at the outset in the hopes that it'll overcome the suspect's resistance. So the situational risk factors here that we flag for increasing the likelihood of a false confession include prolonged isolation and interrogation. Now, nobody can give a specific number of how long is too long. It certainly depends on what's happening during the interview and the interrogation. But certainly what we see is that the longer the interrogation goes, the higher the likelihood of a false confession. In false confession cases, the average length in one study of false confession cases, the average length was 16 hours. Certainly once you start getting over to the 4 or 6 hour mark, it definitely is raising red flags for an increased risk of a false confession. But having said that, I've also seen false confessions happen in a much shorter time period. So again, it doesn't boil down to as simple as you just have to keep it under a certain amount of time. Lying and bluffing about evidence is a significant risk factor to increase the likelihood of a false confession. So police are allowed to lie to suspects in the interrogation room. They're allowed to tell them that they found their DNA evidence, that they found their fingerprint evidence, that an eyewitness identified them. The Supreme Court has generally drawn the line on fabricating actual physical documents. So while you can say that you found their DNA evidence, you can't doctor up a DNA report. So that's where the Supreme Court has generally drawn the line. Bluffing about evidence is also common. So lying is saying, we found your DNA evidence. Bluffing would be more of, is there any reason, is there any reason to believe that when we test the DNA, it's going to come back to be yours, or we found DNA evidence? So not quite saying that you have it, but bluffing about it. And both of those have been shown to increase the likelihood of a false confession. Now, the bluffing about evidence is a little counterintuitive, because you might think that an innocent person, since they know they didn't do it, would think, well, go ahead, you're not going to find my DNA, or you're not going to find my fingerprints because I wasn't there. But what happens is that if you combine bluffing with evidence, with particularly other risk factors, a prolonged interrogation and implied leniency, that an innocent person sometimes will think to themselves, you know what, nothing I say matters. No, they're not going to believe me no matter what I say. When they test the DNA evidence, they're going to see that I'm innocent. So that evidence is actually going to set me free. So I'm just going to tell them what they want to hear just to end this situation. And so they confess, thinking that when the evidence comes back in, it's going to help them. But when the evidence comes back in and it turns out it's exculpatory, their confession was so powerful that that's how we get to the situation where even when there's exculpatory DNA evidence, the people can still be convicted because they're able to explain away the other evidence. And then again, the other two categories of situational risk factors that I want to highlight here are techniques that imply leniency in exchange for confession. And this is incredibly common in modern day North American interrogation, where those minimization techniques that I referred to earlier, where they blame the victim, or they suggest that the offense is really common or not that big a deal or could have been worse, or that this is their chance to cooperate and tell their side of the story. What most of those techniques do is they communicate to the suspect that if you confess, you will get leniency as compared to if you don't confess. And techniques that do that, although they do get guilty people to confess, they also increase the likelihood that an innocent person will confess as well. And then again, disclosing too many case facts. And the reason why that's a risk factor for a false confession is that false confessions, and I'll talk about this more in a few minutes, they look and they feel like true confessions in that they tend to be very detailed narratives of what wrongful convictions, because they look like a true confession should look like. But the reason why they have all those details and all those case facts is because of the use of leading questions and the incorrect use of presentation of evidence in the interrogation room. So essentially, the interviewers oftentimes unknowingly have contaminated the suspect's statement, and they've fed those facts to them that they then incorporate into their confession. that can lead them down a path of tunnel vision where they tend to become so focused on that as what their hypothesis is, what they believe to be true, that they tend to ignore information that is not consistent with that hypothesis that the suspect is guilty. And they tend to put more focus on information that is consistent. And they start to question in a way that confirms their belief, essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that can be very dangerous. So it's really important for investigators to be mindful of tunnel vision. This happens to us in our everyday lives all the time. But investigators in particular need to be really careful when they go into an interrogation to essentially be hypothesis testing. Is the suspect actually guilty? As opposed to the person's guilty and I need to get a confession, which is what they're trained to do during interrogation typically. Okay, so once a false confession occurs, as I said, false confessions tend to look and feel like true confessions. And again, what I mean by that is they tend to be detailed narratives that contain information that only the true perpetrator should know. So police are trained to withhold certain details from the public, from the media. And in false confession cases, what we find is those cases, documented false confession cases, in those false confessions, the suspects provided details that were non-public, that only the true perpetrator should know, which then was used to point out that clearly this must be a true confession because otherwise how could they have known it? But as I was saying before, they got that knowledge through a process of contamination, through poor questioning techniques that where the investigators almost always unknowingly fed them information and didn't realize that they were contaminating the suspect's statement. Okay, so in terms of remedies, I have about 10 minutes to kind of talk to you about where the field is going and what we can do about all of this, and then I'll open it up for questions. First of all, one of the biggest, it's not, I wouldn't call it a remedy, but reforms that we look for is recording of entire interrogations. So this is been definitely making some traction. So about half of the states now mandate recording. Many other departments record as a matter of their own policy. But there is a big difference between recording a suspect's confession and recording an entire interrogation. So oftentimes what we will see is there'll be hours-long interrogation, and then the camera will be turned on for the last 10 minutes to capture the suspect's confession. That isn't a very helpful remedy at all. Instead, what we need is the entire interview from start to finish recorded, because one, it gives us an objective record. It will deter the use of inappropriate techniques. It's incredibly compelling evidence at trial. It almost always benefits the prosecution to see the confession live. But also, if we are concerned about a false confession, it allows us to go back and look at the process through which the confession was elicited in the hopes that it will help us detect false confessions. I am of the mindset that recording is not going to eliminate false confessions. Plenty of false confessions happen on camera, but it does give us a shot of figuring it out after the fact that it may have been a false confession. One of the objections or concerns that is often raised about recording is that if a suspect knows they're being recorded, they'll be less likely to confess. And obviously law enforcement and others are concerned about their ability to still use this evidence in court, because confession evidence is very important, especially in certain types of cases. So a colleague of mine and I, Saul Casson, actually recently just published a study. It came out about a couple of months ago, where we did a randomized field experiment where we partnered with a police department in Rhode Island and used actual cases and had them randomly assign suspects to be informed or not informed that they were being recorded during their interrogations. Everyone was actually recorded. The issue is whether they knew they were being recorded. And we looked to see whether or not that affected how suspects behaved. And in short, it didn't. It didn't change their confession rates. It didn't change their resistance at all. It didn't make them invoke Miranda more. And when we look at case outcome a year later, there was no difference in case outcome, in likelihood of conviction, in case outcome in any measure that we assessed. People who were informed that they were recorded versus not recorded, there was no difference at all. Departments who start to record, there's been research about that, what police perceptions are, and they are overwhelmingly positive once they start to record, because it serves a lot of benefits for police as well. If you have that statement, if you have the entire interview recorded, then you can go back and analyze the confession statement itself as well as the interrogation. So you can look to see what risk factors may or may not have been present during the interrogation. And you can also look at the statement itself in terms of the details that it included, to look to see whether or not it actually did include independent knowledge. So were they able to provide details that only the perpetrator should have known and were not leaked to them? Because if you have the whole interview, you should be able to determine that. And does it lead to new evidence? Did they provide any details that the police didn't know and could later corroborate? Those are some of the ways that we look at a confession after the fact. Another really important reform is to educate legal decision makers about the phenomenon of false confessions and the risk factors associated with those false confessions. That's part of what I'm doing here, but also talking to police groups, attorneys, trying to get the message out that these things do occur and that there are ways to mitigate the risk of false confessions is an important step towards solving or addressing this issue. And then where I spend most of my time is trying to identify and adopt better techniques. So I work with police on a regular basis. My program of research, my goal is to help law enforcement and intelligence agencies identify techniques that work in the sense of eliciting information and confessions from people who are actually guilty in an ethical way, but also to minimize the risk to innocent people. So there has been a growing body of research on how to do this well, and it's quite different from the standard approach that we see in North America up until relatively recently. It's what we call an information gathering focus, as opposed to the goal is to get a confession. In this approach, the goal is to get the truth and to get information, which may include a confession, but may not. It's based on a model of establishing rapport with the subject that you're talking to. And we draw upon the literature of motivational interviewing, which actually comes from the therapeutic literature on how to establish rapport and how to establish a relationship with someone that motivates them to actually want to talk to you, as opposed to what you saw in that video, which is not exactly a rapport-based approach. We train police on good questioning tactics, so how to ask questions in a way that will elicit as much information as possible and to encourage the person to keep talking through active listening skills. And then the use of what's known as the cognitive interview, which is an approach that was originally developed for witnesses and victims, but has now been extended to suspects. And what the cognitive interview is an interview protocol that uses the principles of memory and social dynamics and communication principles and draws upon that literature to capitalize on what we know about those areas, what we know about memory, what we know about how communication works, and elicit more detailed statements from people. And to be used with suspects, there are procedures that we can use within the context of the cognitive interview that actually help us detect a deceit in a way that is far more reliable than the lie detection skills that police think that they have now, but actually are not very effective at determining whether someone's lying or telling the truth. And then we also teach police how to use evidence appropriately in the interrogation room. And what I mean by that is how to disclose evidence in terms of timing and type of evidence to maximize the chance that in response to the disclosure of evidence, the suspect will actually either change their story to the point where they land up admitting, or they contradict themselves so many times that even if they don't admit at the end, that statement that you now have clearly shows that they're lying. And we call that the strategic use of evidence. And that's a technique that's been developed by a variety of researchers. The last thing I wanted to share with you was a slide that shows how, I'm just looking at a question, which I will get back to in 1 minute, what this data is looking like. So I spend a lot of my time now assessing science-based interrogation training programs or interview training programs. I actually, 2 weeks ago, I was in Arizona for a week-long training where we trained some detectives out in Arizona on these science-based methods. And importantly, we don't just train them, we then follow up to see if the techniques actually work. So what we do, for example, is we will have the detectives submit suspect interviews before and after training, and then we code or we score those interviews for the techniques they're using and the outcome, the suspect behavior in terms of cooperation and information disclosure, to see if the science-based techniques are actually leading to more cooperation and information disclosure. And so what I'm going to show to you is the data in the form of what we call a path model. And I just want you to see the trend here. So what we find generally is that when you use good active listening skills, when you use rapport building tactics, it does increase your rapport with the interviewer suspect rapport. That in turn increases cooperation. So if you use those techniques, you get more rapport. When you have more rapport, they're more likely to cooperate. And then most importantly, more cooperation, the more information that they are disclosing to you, which is the ultimate goal. In addition, those cognitive interview techniques that I was just talking to you about, they directly increase information disclosure because they are based on memory principles of how to help people retrieve information from their memory. That increases the amount of detail that they are able to provide. In addition, we also look to see what happens to their use of more traditional accusatorial-based approaches. And I'll tell you that trend in a minute. Before I do, though, good questioning tactics leads to less counter-interrogation behavior on the behalf of the suspect. So these are things that they do to resist the interrogation. They say no comment, or they give monosyllabic responses. If you use better questioning tactics, they're less likely to engage in that behavior. On the other hand, the more accusatorial tactics you use, the more confrontational tactics like the ones you saw in the video, that actually increases those resistance behaviors. And those resistance behaviors are related to less cooperation, which in turn means less information. So actually what the data tell us is that the accusatorial approach often is counterproductive in that it leads to more resistance and therefore less information. Okay, so I know that that is a lot to throw at you all. I'm gonna skip those last two slides, last two arrows, because they're not as important to getting to your questions. So let me start with the couple of questions that have come in. So 2 questions. Is it possible to get a copy of that study? How, as oversight, can we be effective at minimizing false confessions? So is the study that you're referring to the recording study? And if it is, absolutely. If it's a different study, I'm sure I can get it for you as well. I'll just need to know which one it is that you were asking about. So if you want to type that answer in, I can do that. So in terms of as oversight, how can you be effective at minimizing false confessions? Well, if I understand what this audience, a lot of you do, and I may misunderstand it, but my understanding is that you are often faced after with the fact of trying to determine whether you may have had an interrogation with risk factors for a false confession or a coerced confession. In which case, I think one of the things you can do is get more information about what you should be looking for and how to do a reliability analysis on a confession statement, on a narrative, to be able to determine kind of the likelihood that that is what you might be dealing with. There are also experts that you can consult to help you do this, you know, researchers who do this type of work. And then certainly to the extent that you have the ability to influence law enforcement practices, I don't know whether that's, you know, the avenue that you have, but I would imagine that, you know, the oversight as cases might land up where there is a finding of some problematic use of techniques, that the back end of that is that change occurs because change is forced to occur. But if you have partnerships with law enforcement where you can make inroads in moving them towards better practice, that certainly would help and go a long way. Other questions? Yes, I believe this is being recorded for the person who needed to leave. I had an earlier question about the lack of understanding of Miranda warnings and whether it makes sense as a matter of policy to provide youth with greater automatic protection, such as the presence of an attorney. Certainly, and I think many states have moved in that direction for people for those vulnerable populations, that giving them extra protection. Having said that, it is not uncommon for parents, for example, to be present in an interrogation room and not be an effective safeguard for juveniles. In fact, oftentimes they encourage their child to cooperate and provide a statement because they also fall prey and believe that it will be in their child's best interest. So probably a lawyer would be a more effective safeguard than a parent, per se. But certainly that makes sense if you are solely focused on mitigating the risk to juveniles. Yes, the recording study. So yes, I can absolutely get that a copy for you if you want to email me. Anybody who wants a copy of that study or any other. I have another question. You had mentioned some risk factors in false confessions. How does race and socioeconomic status play into false confessions and the type of interrogation methods used? So that's a great question. My answer is that I know of no studies that necessarily link race and socioeconomic status to a higher rate of false confession as a risk factor per se. So for example, you know, I don't think there's any reason to believe that Hispanics are more suggestible and therefore more vulnerable in the interrogation room than whites. Having said that, whether there are patterns of overrepresentation of certain groups, again, I don't know of it. I would be surprised if there isn't a pattern of overrepresentation with race, only because we see that in the body of wrongful conviction cases. But I don't know that we have empirical research on that question exactly. Okay, another question, how would your research and work translate to police oversight and officer interviews? So I don't know, Cami, if you can jump in here, or if the questioner wants to type in, by officer interviewers, do you mean interviews, do you mean police interviews? And while I wait for that to come in, to police over, oh, go ahead.
I believe they're referring to the interviews of officers. Oh, yes, and he just typed that in.
Do you mean, though, police questioning of a suspect or oversight of, I'm going to need
investigators questioning officers in their investigations of police misconduct.
Okay, so if you are actually the one doing the interviewing, you will be most effective if you understand the science-based techniques yourself and use those. Because the interview techniques that we teach for suspect interviewing are the same interviewer techniques that I would teach to attorneys, to any sort of person that's doing any sort of investigative interviewing. And so I would say the research is directly applicable in that you want to use those good interviewing techniques when you're doing the interviewing of the interviewers. And then in addition to that, obviously understanding the accusatorial approach and what they were doing will help you inform, be able to elicit the information that you need from those interviews. I don't know if that answered the question, but how can civilian oversight boards influence police departments to change their techniques? I guess my answer to that would be a question, which is to say, what happens when you have a finding of inappropriate conduct? Does that officer then get sanctioned in some way? So I don't know if anyone's going to chime in, but I may not know enough here to speak to the cycle. Cami, is that you?
Yes.
Okay.
So without them chiming in, so often if there is a finding of misconduct, then often there is some sort of sanction that's applied depending on the type of misconduct and the jurisdiction that you're talking about. And so I would guess that what many are concerned with is that the issue of false confessions and less than adequate interrogation methods, how do they, as civilian oversight practitioners, help to influence any police department changing those methods?
You know, this is a tough question, and here's why. All of the techniques that I was talking to you about accusatorial techniques, for them, they're not against the law. So I would think that most of the time where there is some sort of finding of misconduct, it's because they crossed a line, a legal line. And almost all of what I've talked to you about today is legal, but that doesn't mean it's effective at eliciting diagnostic information, which is just a fancy way of saying good information. So information from guilty people, but not from innocent people. And so it's certainly, as you make findings of inappropriate conduct, that filters back and sends a message. But this is bigger than that, because this is having to change the police culture of how they do things. And that's complicated because right now, for example, most police, the most influential and the most commonly trained interrogation school is called the Reed method, or the Reed technique. And that is still standard teaching practice. And we're just getting to a place where there's an alternative, these science-based alternatives. And so I mean, the honest answer is I don't know yet, but I think the first step is for you guys to become informed that there is another way and there's a better way. And it's not necessarily about turning around and saying you're doing it wrong, but rather there is a better way and everybody benefits if we move to that better way, because nobody wins when there's a false confession. The actual perpetrator goes free, and obviously an innocent life is ruined. So it's a hard shift and it's a slow shift, but it's about getting them on board in the front end and encouraging them to look at this differently. So I wish I had a better answer. Let's see, how do you cultivate the relationship between a new oversight board and the police department, especially if they've already been vocal? So I don't know. That's a great question. I will say this. I'm an academic and I am still learning, but I have learned a lot about how to make inroads and establish relationships with police departments and police officers. There is a natural distrust sometimes about outsiders, especially academics. So you can imagine that when I get up in front of a room of police officers to tell them how they should interview and interrogate, and they look at me and they say, how many times have you conducted an actual suspect interview? That can be a hard gap to overcome. But what I've found is most effective is first being open and honest with the fact that I am there. I'm not the enemy. I'm not there to try and hurt them. I'm there to try and help them and facilitate them. And it's about making relationships and establishing trust with the groups you're working with. I would imagine something called an oversight board and the people sitting on it. There is also similar challenges and maybe even more so about the natural distrust between your organization and the police. And so I think, again, establishing relationships and trust and at the outset and getting buy-in is the key. And how you do that, I think, I don't have a good answer, except that I'm sure the answer is trust between the two of you. Oversight can recommend best practices, for example, recording full interviews, especially if they're, so if part of what you can do is recommend best practices, not only recording, but also recommending different types of training to police and to move towards science-based training and move away from accusatorial approach. Another big training company, which some of you may have heard of, was Wicklander and Zulawski. And they were actually training the Reed method for a very long time. And they just recently, I think a year ago, announced that they will no longer be using that method because in part over the concern of false confessions. So there is movement in that direction. And I think the extent to which you can encourage that will be helpful. Is there a good place to get more information on science-based interviewing techniques? Yeah. It should be easier than it is. Certainly, please email me and I can send you some literature about it. There's an organization called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or the HIG for short. It is an organization that funds much of my research. And they have put together some material for practitioners and the public that I might be able to forward on to you. I know they're working on a website that hasn't gone live yet, where a lot of this information would be kept, but there are also some articles that I can send out that give you an overview of these types of techniques. Are the percentages regarding the types of wrongful convictions and the number of people who are wrongfully convicted gathered nationwide, or are they from a certain area? So the data that I shared with you was from one database, which is the Innocence Project database, but there are other studies of other data sets of wrongful convictions and false confessions that are larger than just DNA exonerations. There are also data sets from not just here in North America, but from Britain and other places. But if what you're trying to get is a handle on the exact percentage of wrongful convictions and the exact percentage of false confessions, no one can give you those numbers. We can only estimate them, estimate the effects, because it's impossible to, without a crystal ball, to know exactly how many people are wrongfully convicted and how common false confessions really are.
Thank you, Dr. Russano. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, but thank you for an amazing presentation today, and thank you to all of you who have participated. And so we're actually, please take a moment to complete the online survey that will be sent to you shortly to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation. And as Dr. Russano mentioned several times throughout, if you have any more questions or there's information that you're looking for that's specific to today's presentation, please feel free to email her. We're currently developing the next webinar in our series, so please check the NACOLE website for details as they become available. Also, our annual conference will be held next month in Detroit, Michigan. If you haven't already registered, make sure to do so today so that you can be a part of NACOLE's 25th annual conference. Thank you again to you, Dr. Russano, and to everyone here. We look forward to having you at our next training event.